When I heard that the woman was stabbed, I actually heard about this before it was on the news because I think it was one of my classmates in band whose relatives own the restaurant there. It was one of the coworkers that was the one who got stabbed. And so I heard this and I was like, wow.
I was at a supermarket. I remember thinking, and maybe it was because of the videos I had seen, like, what if one of these guys around me just doesn't like Asians and decides to take some kind of action?
There's another aspect to the racism that we feel as Asian women. I think Asian women are sexualized in a way that men aren't.
I remember I was sitting with my friend who we were planning the march with, and we watched the news and we cried together. It was really upsetting. That could be my mom, my friend, just in the nail salon, just getting their nails done and having such a terrible thing happen to them.
And I remember thinking and looking around, well, these people look normal, but what are they really thinking? And so it does have a stress on people's, there's a mental fatigue that I think comes along with all of this hate.
I do have one cousin whose cousin on the other side was mugged in Chinatown in San Francisco.
But there's always this element of Asian women being sexualized in this country. And so the discrimination we face is on top of just the color of our skin, on top of just being South Asian or Korean American or Chinese American. There's also like this fetish that goes along with it.
It was a real shock in 2020 when we were dealing with the COVID outbreak, and all of a sudden we noticed this collateral damage consequence. We noticed that we were beginning to hear about hate incidents and hate crimes against our AAPI community, but it kept persisting and it became worse and worse. And for us in San Diego, our hate crimes against our API community tripled.
So we caught a case of an 83-year-old Laotian male just doing his normal walk, doing it every day, 9 o'clock. And then there's this one person that followed him, asked him if he was Chinese.
But it is alarming, though. The sheer amount of violence that I'm seeing right now is horrendous. It's horrific.
Tripped him and just started, just assaulting him.
And some of those videos I cannot watch. And some of those videos are heartbreaking.
He was severely injured, facial fractures, his eyes were, damaged.
That can be your grandmother. That can be your mom. That can be your dad. That can be your brother, sister. That's any of us.
My father, who really lives in a nice community, walks around the neighborhood just to make sure he gets exercise. I couldn't believe myself and hearing the words coming out of my mouth to tell him, Dad, maybe you shouldn't walk around the neighborhood.
For me, the bigger worry was for my parents who are in Dallas.
I can't be there. Somebody may push you and you can break a hip. Somebody can punch you out of nowhere.
If they're out and they're much older, right? And they're walking around and somebody decides to act out against them, they don't stand a chance.
Especially since having Asian grandparents, I was always worried whenever they went out on the streets, especially where they lived, because it was in the city.
It was hard. It was hard for me to say those words and hear myself say those words. Dad, don't do what you usually do because you could get hurt and you could die. That's just not right.
And it always just made me very protective of them, what would happen and things like that.
Asian hate, you're right, has been around for a long time. A long time. What's this is different is the ferocity of hate toward Asian Americans since COVID.
I have a story about that during the pandemic. My parents live in Leisure World it's in Seal Beach, California. And one woman in particular who became a widow, her elderly husband passed away.
When I first heard that, I was scared. I was scared for my family. I was scared for my father. I was scared for all my Asian friends.
And on the day after his funeral, she received a threatening note in the mail by some other neighbor, basically telling her, thank God your husband's gone. That's one less Asian to think about and worry about. And by the way, you're not welcome here. Why don't you go back home?
I sat down to talk to my family. We made sure that we were aware. My first thing is we need to be vigilant. Wherever we go, we cannot be absent and not be aware of our surroundings.
She's already in mourning, didn't know what to do. So she just placed that letter underneath her mail. And of course, her daughters are there. Daughter's going through the mail and sees this letter. And she's like, Mom, what's this? Oh, no, don't worry about it. Mom, no, what is this?
2 years ago, in the heat of the pandemic, when anti-Asian sentiment was really like big in the U.S., there was a phase. I wouldn't say it lasted long, maybe about a week, but I was scared. I couldn't feel like I could leave the house.
So the daughter was so livid, and she's fully English speaking. She went out and she, shared it with the world.
I did have a sort of feeling that, that what if, that really haunts me.
We hear about it, but very few times do we actually see it, happening. Like the words, the handwriting, the visceralness.
This feeling might have been shared by, like hundreds of thousands of Asian Americans around the US. And I mean, it's also awful to think that people who are part of the LGBTQ community or people who are African American feel this way constantly.
And, even the Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, they all covered this story. And as a result, that old woman, that widow, became like a symbol of older Asian Americans finally changing their mindset of staying from within the shadows and coming out into the light and speaking up for themselves because they are valued. They finally felt valued. I have a voice. And how wonderful that is.
When I heard those speeches in the early days, when our own presidents called it the China virus, and the Chinese virus, and the Kung flu, I was already predicting that this was going to happen because he was putting a face on this tragedy and this scary situation that we're all enduring.
This sort of racism was already happening. Having the president to then reinforce that racial aspect of it was not going to bode well for our community.
And that's no different than, let's say, putting a face on the enemy during World War II. Or when, during Chinese exclusion, when government entities put a face on these monster immigrants who are coming here to take your jobs, do bad things, etc. This fear that it creates.
People want someone to blame. That they want someone to take responsibility for that. And obviously they saw Asian Americans, Asians, as that scapegoats.
So then, sure enough, as predicted, all of a sudden, Asians are completely innocent people are getting attacked and somehow blamed for a disease that started in an entirely different country, a world away.
For the president to reinforce that, and you can put that in a direct contrast to the way President Bush addressed 9/11, saying that we are not going to scapegoat Muslims.
Asian Americans are forever foreign, always seem to be an intruder, always seem to be representing something that is un-American and against what America is.
But at least you had the president using their bully pulpit to stand up and say, this is wrong.
It's like once this hate has been let out, it continues on. And it's a bad and horrible statement about the ignorance of this country.
Asians are viewed as distinct, dissimilar, foreign, yellow peril, those kinds of very hurtful labels and categorizations of an entire race of people have invaded our society, the mindset of many, many people. And so we're seeing this hate come out of individuals.
It's all very personalized. I think of what happened to Japanese Americans. 11,000 Asian Americans today, 120,000 Japanese Americans. And those people were yelled at, screamed at, assaulted, spat at, Japanese Americans right after Pearl Harbor. I mean, all hell broke out for them. I mean, it was a horrible time for Japanese Americans. It is continuous. I mean, yes, it's horrific what's happening now, but I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. There is a history. As I said, from the time that immigrants coming from Asia first stepped on American soil, they were discriminated against, and that is a constant.
I think it's a sad commentary on this nation that where we are today, the vitriol truly of anyone that's different, and Asian Americans getting the brunt of it right now. Although we also, as we all say, this didn't just happen in the last 2 years. This has been happening for the last 100, 200 years here in the country.
Well, the history of hate in our country, unfortunately, is deep, and it stems back more than 150 years.
When you study history, you see repetition. You see patterns that don't go away.
I would start with our Constitution of the United States, which was in 1787. And the Constitution, of course, starts with the language we all know, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. And you have to ask yourself, were the founders focusing on all people or just some people?
You see how propaganda is habitually used throughout history to this day in politics, in dividing people, into calling people the enemy so you could enhance yourself as being the hero against that enemy. I mean, that's a classic use of propaganda that politicians do.
3 years after the Constitution, in 1790, Congress passed the Naturalization Act. And Congress specifically provided for the right of naturalization only to free white persons. So the mid-1860s was when the Civil War was occurring, of course. And one of the benefits of the Civil War, one good thing that came out of it, was the 14th Amendment, providing that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens.
What we're witnessing with Asian hate today is part of that propaganda. Certainly what Japanese Americans went through during World War II was influenced by propaganda. Chinese exclusion was influenced by propaganda.
And so while Congress couldn't deal with birthright citizenship, it could deal with naturalization and limit citizenship through limiting immigration. That's exactly what Congress did. So we all know about the Chinese Exclusion Act 14 years later in 1882, barring immigration of Chinese laborers. And then 42 years later in 1924 was the National Origins Act, which virtually eliminated immigration by the Japanese into the United States.
If you just show, these horrible cartoons from newspapers from 1870s to the 1940s to 2020, I mean, they're parallel. And it's seemingly having the same, damning agenda that is not based on fact whatsoever.
Shortly thereafter, the hostilities with Japan were increasing from World War I leading into World War II. We, of course, had Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. And what we saw there is well known. We saw the mass incarceration, internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans, most all of whom were either citizens or lawful permanent resident aliens.
If anything, it just reiterates that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to truly upholding the beliefs that America was built on, that all men are created equal.
The official report during redress, when they look back at the 1940s and what caused the incarceration, it came down to three things: racism, wartime hysteria, and a lack of political leadership. And when you look back at the last 2 years and you try to figure out why is all this anti-Asian hate happening, I think you go back to the same thing. It's racism, it's COVID hysteria, and it's a lack of political leadership. And when I say lack of political leadership, I mean it goes all the way to the top here in America.
It did remind me of the auto wars. And back when people were blaming Japanese automakers for the slump in the economy, and I remember somebody threw stuff at my mother.
Going into the 1980s, you had a lot of Japan bashing. You had Congress people on the news taking baseball bats to Japanese-made cars. And so you had a lot of Asian hate, specifically anti-Japanese sentiment in parts of the Midwest where people were getting laid off.
The import of Japanese vehicles was really taking off. Nissan, Toyota, Honda was really starting to accelerate. The quality of the cars, the price of the cars, and it was beginning to really hurt the American auto industry.
In 1982, I picked up the Detroit Free Press, which is a newspaper there, and on the front page, there was a story about a Chinese man who went to his wedding bachelor party and was murdered that evening.
He and his friends go to a strip club as his bachelor party. There's an altercation between Vincent Chin and his friends and two out-of-work Detroit auto workers. They are all thrown out of the club, and afterwards, Vincent is hunted down and he is bashed to death with a baseball bat.
I remember thinking to myself, wow, this guy was killed because they thought he was Japanese.
He dies several days later. The men didn't even spend the night in jail. They're released on bond on their own recognizance, and they plead manslaughter. Basically, they get probation. There was no justice for Vincent Chin, and this really galvanized then Asian Americans in the Midwest and on both coasts to really take a look at then the link between institutionalized racism like Congress, Japan bashing, and the impact and effect on Asian Americans.
I'm sure it played a role in me wanting to become a police officer, in ensuring that, right is right and wrong should be held accountable, and to defend the weak and to defend the victims of any type of crime. I'm sure it played a role in my life.
My brother, he's in the East Coast, more the South and East, and he is a physician as well. And they have patients basically yell out, "I don't want that Asian doctor. I don't want to see that Asian doctor." And here he is in the emergency room trying to help.
I face some of those, working the front line with the COVID vaccine operation. Patients would tell me that they don't want nurses who are Asian looking to give them the injection.
There was a patient in line where, when they're waiting for the vaccine, they pointed and said, "We're here because of them, because they eat dogs."
I have seen patients who have been the victims of Asian American Pacific Islander hate, who've come in because they were assaulted. No words exchanged other than indications that they, weren't welcome here, or they didn't want, COVID to be in our community, and being beat up.
I had patients tell me that I was the cause of the COVID virus coming to America. So why am I working, helping get folks vaccinated? Those are the comments that we would hear quite often, from verbal abuse to physical abuse.
When I still talk to my peers who are in the emergency department, they're burnt out, and it's heartbreaking because they're trying their best to do what they're called to do, and that is to help people out and save lives. But at the same time, the anger and the hatred that they hear, it's demoralizing. I've had so many old colleagues reach out to me and say, "Hey, do you have an opening in your department? Because I can't do this anymore."
I know of a few in particular doctors who are facing PTSD because of the fears they have when patients come in and are overtly aggressive toward them.
Growing up in Dallas, you get used to the racism and the hate as you're growing up as kids. It's just something that you kind of get used to.
I still have some PTSD thinking about some of the comments that were made to me during the COVID operation, because it brought back a lot of memories when I was a kid.
one of my friends who was Asian American had her garage door spray painted with swastikas because she was Asian American.
They would call racial names like, nips, or the ones that's consistent. I remember to this day.
I think a lot of things that happened to me in the child have been suppressed for so long that you just don't want to talk about it. You just want to move on.
They would call me gook. That was a famous term that they would call Vietnamese. And, I got in fights. And it was something that, you had to do to defend yourself so that you don't continue to be bullied.
We've been always taught as a culture to keep your head down, keep going, and you'll work through it. But I don't think that's right. I mean, I'm realizing that doesn't change anything. We need to shed some light into the darkness.
In second grade, I was the only student of color in class. My teacher was Mrs. Heffel. This was at El Sierra Elementary School. And I don't know, I talked a lot, apparently. I had a problem talking. And she wanted to make an example out of me. And so during reading time, she said, I was talking and she said, I can't stand this anymore, now I have to punish you. So she put me in the corner and she taped my mouth shut with masking tape. And then she put a dunce cap on my head.
As I'm just talking with my, fellow members in our organization, as we're getting to know each other, the memory of our front lawn being set on fire came back.
I mean, the whole thing was very shameful. And it was all because I was a second grader and I wanted to talk and communicate with my fellow classmates. And what's interesting is she never did this to any other students.
I don't think I've fully processed it. Sorry.
And the worst part about the story is I couldn't tell my parents because my parents being very immigrant, they would always side with the teacher, right? And so I had to hold the shame for so many years. I couldn't tell my parents because I was afraid that they would beat me up, right?
We had some neighbors that we weren't the greatest friends with. The daughter of that family had a boyfriend. And the daughter came and knocked on our door and told us that our lawn was on fire. And it was right outside my sister's window.
I used that story about getting my mouth taped shut as a joke for many years. But I realized I kept it as a joke because there was so much pain behind that story. And so I reached out to the principal of El Sierra Elementary School in 2020.
Apparently they'd been drinking, and they knew we were a Japanese family. And I don't know if it's to scare us or if it was to hurt us.
I told him, I said, I want you to know that this was part of the history of your school. And I do think it was racial. And I'm 51 years old and I'm still getting over it. And this is part of my healing process.
And fortunately, it came to get us in time. But as soon as we found out, we tried to put the fire out and obviously called the fire department. But it was hard for me to understand exactly why that happened.
They said, we're so sorry this happened to you. Do you mind if we share the story with other teachers as part of a learning process? And we won't share your name or whatever. I go, fuck yeah, share my name. And here's my fucking face. I sent them a picture of when I was 8 years old.
I don't think I put one and one together until relatively recently. That's why I'm getting pretty emotional about this, because as a kid, you don't want to think that people hate you because of the way that you look or where you came from.
And I look at that little girl, and she was a different person, because I'm a different person. And I look at her and I felt so sorry for that little girl because she had nobody to turn to.
The hardest part for me was, throughout that summer, just seeing that scorched earth.
I'm sorry I get so emotional. I didn't mean to do that. But, you know, I guess this goes back to say that from a very early age, I knew I was different. Both different in my personality. I didn't fit the model of what Asian Americans are supposed to be like in class.
It was hard to accept because there's no other home that I knew of.
And I also felt like in the white world, I also didn't fit and I knew I was different. You know, back in the time when, quite frankly, society, American society, didn't know what Asian, Korean, Chinese, what Asian American meant.
I'm a proud American. I love my country. But it was hard to accept that maybe it was purely because of the way we looked. Or that people would try to hurt us or intimidate us or bully us. So as a kid, it was hard to process that.
And in some ways, it's a blessing to have these numbers, the 11,500. Not a blessing that they occurred, but a blessing that all of this is happening so that we are documenting it and we can say there is no question that this is happening. So what are we going to do about it?
Today, we see, for example, just this month last year, Congress passed the COVID Hate Crimes Act, which condemned the hateful conduct and violence against Asian Americans. The President of the United States spoke out and condemned this in a robust way, hit it directly.
We decided to use technology and to establish the first online reporting tool in the whole nation with regard to hate crimes. But then we also included an ability to email and the ability to call a hotline.
We want to make sure that the family know that we're there, that they have the representatives in the police department that look like them and talk like them and that understand their culture.
We thoroughly investigate incidences. We will go after those that commit these crimes. And then we've got a district attorney's office that will seek the justice that victims deserve.
And the key to this, in order to build trust with the community and to make sure that the voices are heard, that there's empowerment, that people know their voice matters, and that report was important to us, they get a call back within 24 hours.
What Kaiser Permanente has done is the organization has been very deliberate in our approach to educating and our staff.
If you correct the behavior right there and then, not only do you give strength to the workers or the healthcare workers around them to say that you empower people to say, hey, wrong is wrong.
There's a zero tolerance for any type of racial comments, any type of misbehavior within the organization. There's a strong position the organization has taken, both internally as well as externally.
There is a problem with racism in this country. And it's not just against Asian Americans, it's against all people who don't look like the majority, right? Or who are considered other.
Maybe one of the positives from the pandemic is, and one of the positives from all this anti-Asian hate is that it's brought the Asian American community together, and hopefully we'll be stronger as a group because of this.
The need to continually work together, especially among the communities of color, especially with the African American community, with the Hispanic community, LGBTQ. We need to really work together. Asian Americans really need to take a lead too and continue to break down the racial barriers.
The Unity March, the first inaugural Unity March led by a coalition of AAPI groups in Washington, D.C., proved that we're all here together. That was the moment that we can all celebrate this unity, this allyship, but that we have to gather together because this is still a long road that we must literally hold hands and speak our truths together and say, we're still here, we've always been here, and we're going there together.
There's two things that we can do. One is to meet with leadership in the other communities and talk to them about what their needs are and how we can help them.
We need to do a better job of being part of the larger community. And when we show up, we need to have the courage to say, I belong here. I belong at the seat of the table. I want to help create the menu.
The other thing is, I think we need to be willing to be the infantry. We need to put boots on and we need to go to their events or go to work in those communities, and we just need to be present as a first step.
I want the younger generations to really think about our DNA, where we come from, you know? And if we remember what that is, then you will be not what we bought into as the model minority, as the person who is silent, as the people who doesn't say or do anything, not proactive. These are all myths that's weep on us. We need to get out of it.
Yeah.
Because we are daughters and sons of people who built the railroad. We are daughters and sons of the migrant worker. We are the daughters and sons of the Japanese farmer.
This kind of history, our Asian American history, a collective Asian American history, is just not taught in the schools.
If you want to change people's minds, you get them when they're developing their minds, like when they're in high school.
We cannot be banning books because it makes us uncomfortable, you know? We have to tell these stories. We have to put it in our educational system. We have to be openly talking honestly about these issues.
The education part is really important, you know, whether it's at the high school or even college level, to allow others to become aware and to learn about cultural differences.
It does go back to education, but instead of beating that over and over again, I think we have to look at enhancing our own worldliness.
But we're still in an ugly place, and there's a lot of upset in the community, and it's the same for Asian Americans and African Americans.
Also opening our eyes to seeing what's happening to Latinos, what's happening to Indigenous Americans for centuries.
For the first time in a long time, since probably the 60s and 70s, I saw young people out in force. And it's their time. I believe it's their time to start running things and taking some control over their own futures.
In this day and age right now, it's so key and critical for the young people to be involved in any kind of organization, wherever their passion is.
It gave me a lot more hope than I might have had before, that things could change more quickly than I thought they could. We need all the young people from all of the communities to be out together.
We need more Asian American young people to have a voice, and it's been great to see over the last several decades that more and more of the younger generation are speaking up, running for student government, running for office.
It's their turn to make the world what they want it to be. To see young people out in force is very gratifying to me.
The fact of the Vincent Chin's death had sparked a movement of the coalescence of our pan-Asian American communities coming together. America is going to see us because we've always been here. This is the time for us to really lift up those voices who haven't felt that kind of power.
I look at America as being truly the land of immigrants. And there's a question, I think, that politics plays into about what it means to be an American. You know, who gets to be an American?
Each generation gets better as we get more and more integrated. And yes, we have seen this surge of anti-Asian hate since COVID-19, and we're talking about Black Lives Matter. But these are important conversations that we're having. These are conversations that are going to allow us to get to a better tomorrow.
We all need to focus, you know, all together. Unity is really the key, you know, and we can do it. We can do this, you know, and time is now. Mm-hmm. Don't take it for granted that, oh, we got time. We ain't got no time. Time is now.
So I have a lot of faith in the new generation growing up with more woke parents, with better stories that are being told, and just better representation overall.
Being an American is not a color or a race, or it's nothing more than an attitude. You know, you accept the principles of this country. You work hard, you abide by the law. You support your country, and you're entitled to the American dream.